everybody. 2015. I'd like to thank Director Barnes and Director Monk for being here. And with that, I understand we do have a speaker, but we'll call on him during the agenda item. And with that, I will ask if there are any questions on the consent. Then I'll ask for a motion if there is one.
I'll make a motion that we approve the consent agenda.
I second.
Wonderful. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Director Monk?
Aye.
Director Barnes?
Aye.
And Director Scheidegger?
Aye. Thank you very much. With that, we'll move to the action items, and I would ask the Board Secretary, Ms. Pinilla, to please present that item.
Thank you, Director Scheidegger. Before you this evening, we have a request from staff to change the Finance and Audit Committee meeting date and the Policy Committee meeting date. Currently, the Finance and Audit Committee meets on the second Thursday of each month, and the Policy Committee convenes on the fourth Thursday, and that is scheduled for January with special meetings held as needed. Generally, those are the fourth Thursdays. Staff is proposing this change to allow staff to make timely and effective presentations to the Finance and Audit Committee as it relates to budgetary requirements. So before you this evening, you have the track changes version of the policy and procedures, along with what the final edit version would look like if you approve those changes. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Is the Finance Committee aware of this proposal?
The Finance Committee was made aware. It was not during a formal presentation.
Okay, so
We
they will
talked
be.
about it at the last meeting, at the last board meeting.
Yeah, during my fire chief's comments, I brought that up. I'm not exactly sure what part of the meeting it was at, but it was
Probably a part that I wasn't here, and I apologize for that.
well, or it might have been during. I think it was during the preparation of the preliminary budget.
Yeah, if it facilitates better the district functions and puts us in a better position to review budgets and odds and ends, I don't see any problem with it.
I just wanted to make sure that they
Well,
were aware before.
and the intent of it is, as we go into our budget cycles, that we wanted to have the Finance and Audit Committee be able to look at the material prior to going to the full board with it. And when we do that on the second board meeting night, that creates it creates the problem of in order to do that, we'd have to actually have a meeting or have that materials presented almost a month in advance. Whereas, as an example, moving in, if we were to adopt this policy, we'd move into next in the final budget cycle, and we'd be able to have that that meeting, the last board meeting in August, for the Finance and Audit Committee. Then we could approve the budget or not, or vote on it on the first meeting, giving 2 weeks time for digestion of the materials.
More expedient in terms of the process.
Well, more thorough, I believe, because as it was now in this last preliminary budget, is essentially would have come to the board the same night as it went to the Finance and Audit Committee, which, or it would have been an entire month in advance, right. Which is problematic.
Right. Director Barnes, did you have any comments or questions?
No, sir, I did not.
Director Monk?
No?
I believe we have someone who wanted to speak on this. Is that correct?
Yes, we do. Director Arzali, would
Director
you like
Arzali,
to?
would you please come up? Do we have the 3-minute clock going?
You got controls of it over there.
So glad
Happy birthday to, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, out of order.
So, the idea is, this seems very, very timely and appropriate for us to begin to look at the parts of policy that exist and to reformulate, restructure, however you want to characterize that, into something that allows directors to first understand the process by which they can gather information, and then to develop that process so that that request for information can go to staff effectively, and then it can be the information can be gathered and returned to the individual director. At the same time, I'm proposing that we move one step further and develop a process whereby a request for information from a director, let's use myself as an example. If I were asking for information on a topic like staffing, then I could forward a formal request to the president of the board. The president of the board, receiving that request, would then poll the sitting board to see if a majority of that board similarly felt and had an interest in that topic. And assuming that they did, then that would move forward, be agendized as an informational meeting where staff could report to the board on that topic. Now, it's as I outlined this to you, it seems laborious, but in fact, when it's done sequentially, it's nothing more than I would, in writing, send an email or a form to the president of the board. The president of the board would, in turn, poll the sitting board to see if there's a majority of them have an interest in this topic. If they do, then a directive goes from the president of the board to staff asking for a date-definite report on this topic. So in that way, if I have an interest in staffing and in my email I would outline what areas of staffing I have an interest, the board president polls the board, there isn't a majority of people who are interested in that, then we're not going to convene a formal meeting on it. But that doesn't mean my request for information doesn't go forward. I will get factual, and as it says in our documents, factual information will be delivered to me in the appropriate timelines. But this way, it avoids someone saying, gee, I'd like to know more about staffing, and thinking that that goes forward as a request. When in point of fact, it would, if you want information on a subject, it would go forward in a written request for information on that subject. That way staff has it, they can respond appropriately. My hope here is, and I don't believe this is going to happen often, but there's an economy of scale inherent in having information be conveyed to the parties that are interested that is specific, it's thorough, and it doesn't waste man-hours on staff time. I'm very sensitive to the idea of having staff trying to do their best as they always do. And I have found myself in this organization saying, what time is it? And the next thing I know, I've got a complete report on the history of the clock because staff does everything they can do. And I'm looking to ameliorate that, to say specifically this is what we want, and staff can then focus on giving us what we need.
Director Orzali, I feel, quite frankly, I might have erred. I thought you were going to speak on the issue of flip-flop policy and finance. You were actually speaking about requests for information from board members and the process under which that would be sought. And you're specifically suggesting that a process be instituted where if a board member desires information, that request would be in writing to the president of the board. Mm-hmm. The board would then the president would then poll the board mm-hmm. to determine if there is other interest in the item, and the agenda item. If there is, then there would be a request and it would be agendized in terms of the information developed and presented to the board as a whole. If there is not interest shared by other board members, it doesn't mean that there would not be a response, but rather that it would go into a different process, not for the whole board, and a more of a fast track.
Exactly, exactly. And I may have, and I want to take this opportunity to blame Director Monk or Melissa or the chief, somebody. It really doesn't matter who, because this was the topic that I came to address, and I may have gotten out of sequence here.
And I think it was my fault. I was assuming that it was on this item, and I guess the only question I'm asking, we do want to take your item, but I wonder if we need to first finish with the item that was on the agenda.
This evening, we have the opportunity to look at any revisions to this policy because it was an agendized action item. So because we're talking about the policies and procedures, it was a good time to bring this to the policy committee's attention and staff's attention, rather than have to wait an additional month then to talk about it later.
Good, so it's not out of order.
It's
That's
not
what
out
I
of
wanted to
order.
clarify. Okay.
Okay, Jack.
My bad, thank you. Director Monk had a question.
I understand what you're saying, Director, as far as items that come before the full board. How does your proposal affect the operation of the Finance and Audit Committee or the Policy Committee?
Only in this way. The policy committee would actually adopt an outline of this as policy. We would be taking the various bits and pieces that we have and formulating a policy that does this. It references the existing policy, but it outlines for, and I'm thinking of future directors, to look at this and say, oh, well, here's the policy procedure when I need information on staffing. This is how I approach that. And I think that it would streamline the process, make it more effective, and much more efficient on the part of staff.
Director Barnes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like the idea because as a newly elected director here, to have something that's streamlined that doesn't task or add additional tasks to staff, as my movie reel mind moves sometimes, I think it's a good idea. I asked for it and I'm hoping to get it later, but this would be a formalized process. That would be something I would be interested in. It would go before the board to see if they're interested in, then also not waste any additional time of staff to collect that data and provide it to us. So that could be discussed. I like the idea. I like the proposal. That way, it does not take time away from staff, but I'd like to hear what Chief Wells says of his thoughts on that as well.
No, I think it's a good way for us to streamline a process. I would tell you that even in the existing document you have before you this evening, there's 7 or 8 different places within the document that specifically discuss this, but they're in different disparate places within the document itself. So potentially synthesizing that one into a comprehensive policy. But as an example, like there's one on, I think it's paginated page 44 in your binder, but it says under public hearings, it says request for comprehensive analysis, in-depth staff or consultant work shall be made as requested through the board of directors. Individual board member requests for follow-up information or related items that can be met with minimal disruption to the operation of the district shall be made through the fire chief. In the event of competing issues, the majority of the board shall make the final determination. So there's a lot of information in this policy, but I would tell you that oftentimes just having it all in one spot might be a good idea. So you don't have to read the 80, and I think there's some other efficiencies in here that are above and beyond what's existing today in policy, as outlined earlier by Director Rosali. So I think for operational, I think it's good. I think it gives us all the same sheet of music that we're playing on so that we can, as directors, it is your purview and your responsibility, in my opinion, to your constituents to get the answers to individual questions, and also to be sympathetic that it is in terms of coming before the full board and a presentation style type of a presentation, that it's something everybody wants to hear. And then to address individual concerns, we can do that outside of the public meeting. But even through a formal process, through me and or through the president of the board of directors, depending on the scope.
Thank you, Chief. My own comment is I agree with Director Barnes in terms of focusing staff effort and time. I see another advantage to what you're saying. I think it'd be helpful for all of us to have an idea of what is being requested, what the interest is, and have a bit of a dialogue with that. I mean, for example, if Director Barnes were to make a request of the president for a particular area, when that comes up, I may say, you know, that's a good idea, but I also am curious about this little angle on it that may not have, you know, been directly incorporated. So I too think it has a lot of merit. Director Monk, did you have another comment?
Yeah, there is value to that, and having all the directors involved in those decisions. The downside is going with that methodology on how to do this, then you're defeating the purpose of your individual board committees. If you're going to send it to the full board, then there's no reason to have a finance and audit committee or a policy committee, because the full board's going to have to hear it.
Well, I guess I'll let Director Orzali.
Well, in beyond beyond the idea of having the policy committee adopt this, let's pursue that a bit. As I see this, the board president would have the purview to ask directly for this information. He could refer it to the executive committee and ask them to assist in gathering the information. But that would be absolutely his call. So and again, using my example of staffing, incidentally, there'll be a request coming forward for staffing. But using that example, board president would receive this from me. He would poll the sitting members of the board. And let's assume now that I was the only one that had an interest in that. That's fine. At that point, the information I'd outlined staff would go about gathering those facts, and that would be delivered to me. If, on the other hand, a majority of the board had an interest in that, then we would do just what we've described here, and there would be a full report to the board on that topic. Now, your point about circumventing the same process, circumventing, let's say, finance. It's really not, I don't see it as circumventing finance. Finance would have the purview. They could do the same thing if the finance committee had interest in a particular topic. They'd use the same process to get information, again, going to the board president. So we've got a single point of control. And beyond that, I think it would be much more expeditious to either the individual, the subcommittees, or the full board to have a clearly delineated process by which we can gather information.
Gary, I don't quite understand why this process would circumvent the subcommittees that exist. How would, for example, the function that the Finance and Audit Committee performs now be circumvented by the institution of this? This is where a board member has a request for information.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that that would not circumvent the function, the process of the Standing Finance and Audit Committee or the Standing Policy Committee. I don't understand how it would.
Yeah. Well, right now, the board of directors is divided into different committees.
Well, we're also a whole, and in this point.
Yeah, but what this is doing is, rather than taking the 3 directors or whatever that are involved in a policy committee or the Finance and Audit Committee, basically out of the picture to some degree, and you're putting the full board on the line in making decisions and hearing this stuff, where the policy committee or the Finance and Audit Committee would review documents or material presented and make a recommendation back to the full board.
If I might, go ahead, Director. The only thing I was going to say is I think when it goes to the board president as a concept, it isn't the intent, I don't believe, to have this now be a general board issue. It would be send that out to the policy committee for further development and come back to the full board for a recommendation or a policy amendment. And or if it was in the finance division or something that needed to be handled by the executive committee, as an example. I don't think it's circumventing anything. It's really just streamlining the work through a predictable process and distributed back into the working groups and brought back to the full board for policy direction. I mean, I can't think of an item that would be different than that.
That's exactly the circumstance that I envision, Chief. If there were a director, and let's say that this was a request from policy or finance, and I want to attend that, then I'll be there. If I want to just see the documents that are generated, then I can have those documents that are generated. But I don't see this circumventing any individual or group. In fact, I think it enhances each of those.
Director Barnes?
Thank you. I agree with you. I think it also opens up future dialogue if it's something that the board as a whole would be interested in hearing, not to, I don't want to use the circumvent, but not to take away from finance or executive committees, but to hear as a whole, it would open up dialogue in a public setting where we can say use your initial example of staffing. It may generate a question I might not realize looking at the numbers, but based off of the dialogue that's being said, that something might now spark an interest and I may have a question would want answered. As we talk and we've used the word streamline, this would do exactly that, as it is funneled through the president of the board, and it's still handed to the policy, finance, and executive committees for their review, their decision-making process, but it allows an individual request to be formalized, streamlined, not to take away from staff's time, and I know you're aware of that as well, but also that can open up dialogue for all of us, so.
I think it would increase transparency to the whole process, up, down, and sideways.
Well, to your point, Gary, I fail to see where this would usurp the standing subcommittees. And I would be concerned if I saw that, but I just don't see that. I'm sorry.
I'll reserve judgment on it, but the majority rules, so.
Well, anything else, Director Rosales?
No, I'm fine. I appreciate the time, gentlemen.
Well then, I guess, Madam Secretary, what this subcommittee needs is a motion, is that correct? To move both of these recommendations? One, to change the standing times for policy and finance, and two, to adopt this policy?
I would recommend that we move the recommendations to switch the finance and policy committee. And then another motion to allow staff to work on the recommendations by Director Orzali and bring them back to the policy committee before going to the full board.
The second would come back.
Yes.
First, at this point, would move ahead.
To the full board, yes.
So what we're looking for then is a motion on, in essence, switching policy and finance.
I'll make a motion to swap policy and finance, the meeting days.
And I second that.
Okay, it's moved and seconded. Call for the question.
So I'm going to call roll with Directors Monk, Scheidegger, and Barnes. Okay.
Yes.
Director Monk,
Yes.
Director Barnes,
Aye.
and Director Scheidegger.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, so that one, now, we have affirmatively voted on that, and that one, is that going to then go to the board?
That will go to the board at the next meeting, the one in July.
Okay. Now, there's a question before us as to whether or not we want another motion.
If you would like to address the,
Rosales.
yes.
Mr. Chair, I would make a motion to adopt and make for Director Rosali's recommendations to formalize a streamlined process of request through staff.
And in that, staff would, as Chief Wells said, consolidate other sections as necessary. Was that part of your?
Yeah, I think we would need to evaluate the policy as it stands and make recommended adjustments, and that could incorporate numerous changes, whatever obviously the pleasure of the board would be, as to the best way to streamline this. I think there's some additional new language that we want to add, and it might be easier to actually bring it out of multiple parts of the policy into its own subgroup so that it'd be more easily identified and understood. So I think the motion would be somewhere along the lines of directing staff to develop policy amendments to incorporate the changes as directed by President Rosali.
Okay. Is there a second? I'll second it. Call for the question?
Director Monk,
I'm going to abstain.
Director Barnes,
Aye.
And Director Scheidegger.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Director Rosali,
Thank you, gentlemen.
particularly for the vocal part. Are there any other agenda items to be considered at this time?
There are no other action items this evening.
And there are no other speakers? So with that, we don't have a specific date set for the next meeting, but as necessary, we'll set that and we'll adjourn. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry,
Hey, what
crappy
happened to
drivers,
traffic?
just people running into each other, job security.